It was a murder that shattered a police department's faith in their own system. They were about to close the case, convinced it was a tragic robbery gone wrong. Then, a single piece of evidence, found in the most unexpected place, tore the entire investigation wide open and pointed the finger at a source of pure evil they never saw coming. Think about that for a moment. An officer, a trained protector, killed not in the line of duty, but in a moment of quiet, ordinary life. His family believed justice was moving forward. The detectives felt they had their answer, but that certainty was illusion. The truth was far more sinister, hiding in plain sight, waiting to dismantle every assumption. What could that one clue possibly have been? How did it completely invert the investigation and force detectives to question everything and everyone they thought they could trust? Imagine this. A quiet Lexington street, the flashing lights of cruisers reflecting in the windows of his neighbors, fellow officers who now had to process a crime scene for one of their own, the weight in their movements, the silent communication of shared grief and fury. They vowed to find his killer, and when they zeroed in on a suspect, they felt that vow was fulfilled. But this case wasn't done with them yet. The break in the case, a discovery so mundane yet so damning, didn't just lead to a new suspect. It revealed a calculated betrayal that would send shockwaves through the entire community. What looked like a straightforward act of violence was, in fact, a carefully laid trap. This is the deeply heartbreaking true crime documentary of the murder of off-duty Lexington police officer's name. We're going deep into an investigation that seemed solved, only to be resurrected by a clue so crucial, it forced detectives to start from zero. We'll examine the haunting final hours, the initial arrest that brought a sense of relief, and then the stunning twist that no one could have predicted. Curiosity-driven questions we'll explore. What was the officer's final, mundane activity before his world collided with the killer's? Why did detectives initially feel such confidence in their first major lead? What was the earth-shattering clue that forced them to scrap their entire theory? This is the core twist. How did this new evidence paint a completely different picture of the killer's motive? Did the officer's training and instincts play a role in the tragic events? How does a close-knit police force cope when the threat may have come from a place they considered safe? This story is a brutal reminder that the surface of a crime often lies. The real story, the true tragedy, is buried in the details. If you think you know where this investigation is headed, you don't. Stick with me until the very end, because the moment we reveal that pivotal clue is the moment this case transforms from a tragedy into a nightmare deception. The full, shocking truth is ahead. Let's begin. The criminal incident that resulted in the death of an off-duty Lexington police officer was initiated by emergency communications received at approximately 9 p.m. on Sunday, December 17th. Multiple callers reported the sound of gunfire emanating from a parking lot located on Cedar Lane Drive, a commercial thoroughfare in Lexington, North Carolina. The specified location was a paved area serving the home and appliance King store, situated near the intersection with Cotton Grove Road. Lexington Police Department patrol units were dispatched to the location with a priority code indicating a shooting in progress. The first responding officers arrived on scene at approximately 9:06 p.m. to find 3 individuals lying on the asphalt pavement, each manifesting visible injuries consistent with gunshot wounds. A shocking discovery awaited the first responders as they recognized one of the gravely injured as a fellow officer, a realization that immediately escalated the procedural gravity of the scene. Emergency medical services personnel, arriving concurrently, performed triage and pronounced one victim deceased at the scene. The 2 surviving wounded individuals were rapidly stabilized and transported by ambulance to a regional trauma center for urgent surgical intervention. The initial assessment by the patrol supervisors, based on the spatial distribution of ballistic evidence and witness statements, indicated a confined altercation involving the 3 individuals present with no immediate indication of additional fleeing suspects. The Lexington Police Department command staff, including Chief Robbie D. Rummage, was notified and responded to the scene. Given that a department officer was involved as a victim, and that the incident likely involved an exchange of gunfire between 2 other individuals, the decision was made to formally request the assistance of the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation. This request followed standard protocol for officer-involved shootings and complex violent crimes with potential conflict of interest for the local agency. The SBI accepted the lead investigative role, a process that commenced before midnight. The scene, now a frozen moment of violence, held the only clues to whether this was a chance encounter or a deliberate, fatal meeting. The SBI evidence response team assumed control of the physical area, which was demarcated by yellow crime scene tape extending across a significant portion of the retail parking lot. Forensic technicians began the methodical process of documenting the scene through photographs, video, and detailed sketches. Evidence markers were placed to designate the location of spent cartridge casings, which were noted to be from 2 distinct calibers, preliminary indicators of 2 firearms being discharged. The final positions of the victims were documented in relation to nearby vehicles, one of which was a personal vehicle registered to Kaitlin Crook. The procedural transition from an active crime scene to a forensic laboratory inquiry began in the early hours of December 18th. The SBI's mandate was to reconstruct the events of the approximately 60 seconds that transpired between the first and final gunshot. This reconstruction will rely on ballistic trajectory analysis, bloodstain pattern interpretation, cellular telephone location data, and later, post-mortem examination results from the autopsy of Officer Crook. The parking lot, ordinarily vacant on a Sunday evening, became an archive of violent action, with each piece of evidence requiring collection, cataloging, and chain-of-custody documentation. The involvement of public safety personnel from both the police and fire departments introduced a layer of institutional complexity to the investigation, necessitating absolute forensic rigor to ensure investigative conclusions will withstand legal scrutiny. The pressing question for investigators was not merely who fired, but what specific series of actions and decisions led a domestic conflict to erupt in lethal violence in a public space. The collection of physical evidence continued until sunrise, after which the parking lot was released back to the property owner. All subsequent investigative activity would shift to the SBI Field Office and Crime Laboratory, where the materials gathered would undergo scientific examination to establish the factual sequence of the shooting. The formal identification of the deceased victim was confirmed by the Lexington Police Department in a press release issued on the morning of December 18th. She was Officer Kaitlin Crook, age 25, a sworn member of the department for approximately 3 years. She was pronounced dead at the scene on Cedar Lane Drive from multiple gunshot wounds. Official notification of her death was delivered to her immediate family by the department's chaplain and a designated notification team before the public release was made. The 2 surviving gunshot wound victims were identified as Zachary Rogers, age 35, and Joshua Moore, age 31. Rogers was confirmed to be a Lexington firefighter and, critically, the estranged husband of Kaitlin Crook. He was transported to Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center in Winston-Salem and listed in critical condition following emergency surgery. Moore, a resident of Thomasville in neighboring Davidson County, was transported to the same facility and listed in stable condition. His injuries were considered serious but not life-threatening. The revelation that the incident connected an officer, a firefighter, and a civilian through intimate personal relationships instantly transformed the case from a standard shooting into a complex domestic homicide investigation. Preliminary statements from the Lexington Police Department, based on the initial scene assessment and witness interviews, confirmed that both Rogers and Moore were armed with handguns during the encounter. The department stated an exchange of fire occurred between the 2 men, and that Officer Crook was also struck during this exchange. She was the only fatality. This initial framework established a core dynamic, a violent confrontation between 2 armed males connected to the same woman, resulting in that woman's death. The location of Crook's personal vehicle and her position relative to the 2 men at the moment the shooting began became paramount questions. Investigators faced a grim task of determining whether she was an intentional target, a collateral casualty of crossfire, or a participant attempting to intervene. The department emphasized that no other suspects were being sought, confirming the incident was contained to the 3 individuals present. The operational and emotional impact on the Lexington Police Department was immediate and profound. Chief Robbie D. Rummage described the event as every chief's worst nightmare in a formal statement, acknowledging the profound grief within the ranks. The department activated its internal critical incident stress management protocols, making counseling and support services available to all personnel. Officer Crook's assigned patrol squad and fellow officers were placed on administrative leave temporarily, a standard practice to allow for grief and decompression following the traumatic loss of a colleague. Simultaneously, the Lexington Fire Department, under Chief Michael R. Tefano, faced its own crisis with a member in critical condition and involved as a potential suspect in a homicide. Chief Tefano issued a statement calling the situation a profound tragedy affecting the entire public safety family. The fire department also implemented its employee assistance resources. The procedural handling of the case was complicated by the identities of the involved parties. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's assumption of the lead role was not merely procedural, but essential for maintaining objectivity. The SBI's jurisdiction removed the investigation from the potential perception of bias within the local agencies whose members were directly involved. The immediate investigative priorities included securing search warrants for medical records to document the nature and trajectory of the surviving victims' wounds, which could provide physical evidence correlating to their stated positions. Warrants were also prepared for the cellular telephones belonging to all three individuals to analyze communication patterns and geographical location data in the hours and days preceding the shooting. The process of interviewing Moore, as a less critically injured participant, was planned as soon as medical staff deemed him fit for a formal law enforcement interview. The interview of Rogers was contingent upon his survival and recovery from critical condition, introducing a significant potential delay into the investigative timeline. The entire case now hinged on forensic evidence and the credibility of survivor's account, as the other principal witness was deceased. Kaitlin Crook was a lifelong resident of Davidson County, North Carolina, having been born and raised within its communities. Public records and background information obtained from official sources following her death indicate she was a graduate of a local public high school within the county school system. Following her secondary education, she pursued employment in several vocations with service-oriented focus, though specific details of this pre-law enforcement employment are not contained within the publicly released memorial statements or personnel records. Her decision to apply for a position with the Lexington Police Department aligned with a demonstrated pattern of seeking community-oriented work. She entered the department as a recruit officer and was enrolled in a basic law enforcement training program at an accredited regional training academy. Her successful completion of this physically and academically rigorous curriculum demonstrated a determined commitment to profession she would ultimately serve for 3 years. Her personnel file, as referenced in general terms by the Lexington Police Department administration, documented a standard progression through her probationary period to full sworn status. Colleagues and supervisors, in statements provided to media for memorial purposes, consistently describe her as conscientious, reliable, and positive in her demeanor. Her performance evaluations reflected competency in core patrol functions. There were no formal disciplinary actions noted in the limited public summaries of her record. The transition from civilian life to law enforcement is a substantive undertaking, involving not only the acquisition of technical skills in criminal law, defensive tactics, and firearms, but also the internal adoption of a heightened sense of situational awareness and public responsibility. This ingrained training makes the circumstances of her death, caught in a violent conflict between two known individuals while she was off duty and out of uniform, a subject of particular and tragic irony. Her life outside of the police department, however, became the central focus of the criminal investigation launched on December 17th. The personal relationships that defined her private existence were the very elements that converged with lethal consequence in the Cedar Lane Drive parking lot. Public records confirmed her legal marriage to Zachary Rogers, a union that predated her entry into law enforcement. The duration and specific timeline of their subsequent estrangement has not been formally detailed by investigators, though it was confirmed factual status at the time of the shooting. Her more recent romantic involvement with Joshua Moore, identified by police as her current boyfriend, established a triangular dynamic that investigators would scrutinize for motive. The human narrative suggested a person navigating the common but difficult transition from one life chapter to another, a process that in this instance culminated in an unthinkably violent endpoint. The investigation by the State Bureau of Investigation would inevitably reconstruct her final days and hours. examining her communications, movements, and expressed concerns. This process would seek to determine if she had perceived any specific threat, if she had made prior reports of harassment or intimidation, or if she had taken any personal security measures indicative of fear. The contrast between her professional identity as a trained officer and her personal vulnerability in a domestic context would become a poignant subtext of the case. Her death did not occur during a traffic stop or a response to a violent call, the scenarios for which she was trained and equipped, but in a context where personal conflict overrode professional preparedness. The totality of her identity, the public servant and the private individual, was subsumed by the forensic and legal questions surrounding the sequence of gunfire that ended her life. The path Kaitlin Crook undertook to become a sworn law enforcement officer for the Lexington Police Department was governed by the comprehensive standards established by the North Carolina Criminal Justice Education and Training Standards Commission. This process begins with a conditional offer of employment from a law enforcement agency, contingent upon a candidate successfully navigating a multi-phase vetting system. The initial phase involves an extensive background investigation that examines criminal history, driving record, credit history, and personal references. This is followed by a psychological evaluation administered by a state-certified clinician to assess suitability for the unique stresses of police work, a physical examination, and a drug screening. Only upon satisfactory completion of these prerequisites is a recruit permitted to enroll in a basic law enforcement training academy. The academy represents a transformative period where civilians are systematically instilled with the knowledge, skills, and mindset required for armed public service. The BLET curriculum is a mandated minimum of several hundred hours of instruction. It is divided into numerous blocks of study, including but not limited to criminal law, juvenile law, civil process, patrol procedures, traffic law enforcement, emergency vehicle operation, firearms proficiency and safety, defensive tactics, arrest techniques, and first responder medical care. The training emphasizes legal authority, constitutional limitations, particularly regarding search and seizure, and the graduated use of force. Recruits are subjected to scenario-based training that simulates high-stress encounters, requiring the application of legal knowledge and tactical decision-making under controlled conditions. Successful graduation from the academy results in the award of a law enforcement certification, but does not conclude the training process. A newly certified officer is then required to complete a field training program under the direct supervision of a senior field training officer. This FTO phase, which lasts for several months, involves a probationary officer applying academy lessons in real-world patrol situations, with continuous evaluation and correction. It is during this protracted period of supervised practice that theoretical knowledge is forged into operational habit and instinct. Officer Crook's completion of this entire process indicated her ability to meet the state's rigorous professional and ethical benchmarks. Her daily duties upon achieving full solo patrol status would have encompassed the full spectrum of municipal police work. Respondent calls for service ranging from noise complaints to domestic disturbances, conducting preliminary investigations, enforcing traffic statutes, preparing detailed incident reports, and testifying in court. The professional culture inherently emphasizes constant threat assessment and situational awareness, skills that are drilled to become automatic. This training background introduces a compelling analytical dimension to the circumstances of her death. Investigators would consider whether her law enforcement experience influenced her actions in the moments preceding the gunfire. Potential considerations include whether she attempted to verbally de-escalate the confrontation between Rogers and Moore, whether she identified herself as an officer, or whether she moved to position herself defensively. However, without direct eyewitness testimony from an independent observer or definitive forensic reconstruction of her precise movements, such considerations remain speculative. Her status as a trained officer did not afford her the practical advantages of her uniform, her duty weapon, her patrol vehicle, or immediate backup when a personal conflict escalated to lethal violence. The badge and the training it represents exists within a structured professional context that was entirely absent on the evening of December 17th. Kaitlin Crook and Zachary Rogers entered into a legal marriage, a matter of public record in Davidson County, North Carolina. The specific date of the marriage ceremony is documented within County Register Deeds archives, though this detail was not emphasized in initial law enforcement statements following the shooting. The The marriage represented a formal union between two individuals who would each pursue careers in public safety within the same municipal jurisdiction. Crook as a police officer and Rogers as a firefighter. This professional parallel likely informed certain shared experiences and social circles. However, at some point prior to the incident on December 17th, the marital relationship underwent a significant deterioration, leading to a state of estrangement. In legal and social terms, estrangement signifies a definitive breakdown of the marital partnership, often involving physical separation, emotional dissolution, and the contemplation or initiation of divorce proceedings. The precise catalyst for the separation and the timeline of its progression have not been disclosed by investigating authorities. This period of marital dissolution established a foundational discord that would later intersect with a new relationship, creating a volatile interpersonal landscape. The existence of Joshua Moore as Kaitlin Crook's current boyfriend was confirmed by the Lexington Police Department in its preliminary factual releases. This new romantic involvement, following the estrangement from Rogers, established a classic triangular dynamic frequently encountered in criminal investigations involving domestic homicide. From an investigative standpoint, the introduction of a new partner is a statistically recognized risk factor for escalated conflict, as it can catalyze intense feelings of jealousy, possessiveness, and perceived betrayal in a former partner. The State Bureau of Investigation's inquiry would necessarily focus on documenting the history of interactions among these three individuals. This would involve subpoenaing records of communications, text messages, social media exchanges, and call logs to identify any patterns of harassment, threats, or hostile confrontations. Investigators would also seek to determine the duration and seriousness of the relationship between Crook and Moore as perceived by both parties and by external witnesses. The central, agonizing question for detectives was whether the parking lot meeting was a premeditated confrontation or a disastrous coincidental encounter, with the answer lying buried within the digital and testimonial history of these relationships. The human theory underpinning the investigation is one of common tragedy arising from common circumstances. It posits that the termination of marriage and the subsequent formation of a new attachment created a cauldron of unresolved emotions, primarily involving the estranged spouse, which ultimately erupted into violence. This theoretical framework is supported by national crime statistics regarding the prevalence of domestic violence as a precursor to homicide. However, the legal application of this theory requires specific, admissible evidence of intent and action. The mere existence of discord is insufficient. Evidence must demonstrate a deliberate move toward a violent confrontation. The investigative process would therefore meticulously reconstruct the hours and days leading to December 17th, examining whether Rogers had made attempts to contact or surveil Crook or Moore, whether there had been prior physical altercations, and whether any party had expressed fear or made preparations indicative of anticipating violence. The totality of this background would be critical for the district attorney's office in assessing charges such as first-degree murder, which requires premeditation and deliberation, versus lesser homicide charges or potential claims of self-defense. The personal history of love, marriage, and distance was thus not merely a backdrop, but the probable motivational engine for the lethal violence that followed. Following her estrangement from Zachary Rogers, Kaitlin Crook initiated a romantic relationship with Joshua Moore, a resident of Thomasville, North Carolina. Thomasville is located within Davidson County, approximately a 10-minute drive from the city limits of Lexington. The precise inception date of this relationship has not been established in public documents or official statements. The duration and depth of the partnership at the time of the December 17th shooting are subjective factors that will be explored by investigators through interviews with acquaintances, family members, and an analysis of personal communications between Crook and Moore. Moore's professional background, distinct from a public safety sector occupied by both Crook and Rogers, placed him outside the immediate institutional fraternity of police and fire personnel. This new personal chapter for Officer Crook represented a deliberate movement beyond her previous marriage and an investment in a future separate from her estranged husband. Such new beginnings, while fundamentally ordinary, are often identified in forensic psychology as periods of elevated risk when a former partner perceives a new relationship as a permanent threat to reconciliation or as a source of profound personal humiliation. The development of this new relationship would have been a primary subject of the State Bureau of Investigation's inquiries into motive. Investigative focus would center on the nature and frequency of any interactions between Moore and Zachary Rogers prior to the fatal encounter. Detectives would seek to determine if the two men had any prior direct contact, whether hostile or otherwise, and if Rogers was aware of the specific identity and details of Crook's new partner. The collection of digital evidence would be paramount. Search warrants for cellular telephone data would aim to reveal location patterns that might indicate surveillance, as well as any threatening or antagonistic communications sent from Rogers to Moore or vice versa. Furthermore, interviews with mutual acquaintances might reveal if Rogers had made verbal comments expressing anger, resentment, or threats regarding Crook's new relationship. The transition from private emotional distress to public violent action is a critical threshold of the investigation needed to delineate with factual evidence. The ordinary human endeavor to find happiness and stability after a marital breakdown formed the ostensibly normal backdrop to a meeting that culminated in extraordinary violence. The commonplace nature of this progression, separation, grief, moving on, stands in stark contrast to the extreme outcome, a disparity that often defines tragedies categorized as domestic homicides. The investigation would operate on the premise that the parking lot meeting on Cedar Lane Drive was not random, but was instead a direct result of the intersecting paths of these three individuals. Several investigative scenarios would be considered. A prearranged meeting between Rogers and Moore, perhaps under the guise of discussion that turned violent, an encounter where one party followed the other to location, or a situation where Crook and Moore were present together and were approached by Rogers. Each scenario carries distinct legal implications regarding premeditation and the principle of who was the initial aggressor. The new chapter for Kaitlin Crook was, by the evening of December 17th, inextricably and fatally entangled with the unresolved conflicts of her previous chapter. The personal narrative of moving forward was ultimately overtaken by a violent confrontation rooted in the past, a convergence that will be painstakingly deconstructed through forensic evidence and the subsequent statements of the surviving participants. The convergence of Zachary Rogers and Joshua Moore in the parking lot of the Home and Appliance King store at approximately 9 p.m. on December 17th represents the pivotal nexus of the incident, the precise moment where separate personal histories collided with lethal force. Both men were confirmed by law enforcement to have been in possession of handguns at the time of the encounter. The specific makes, models, and calibers of these firearms have not been publicly disclosed by the State Bureau of Investigation, pending formal ballistic testing and the completion of the investigative file. The legal status of their possession, whether either or both men held valid North Carolina concealed carry permits, is a matter of record that will be verified but is not typically released during an active investigation. The fundamental and unresolved question underpinning the entire case is a circumstance that brought both armed men to the same location at that precise time. Investigators were immediately tasked with determining whether this was a coincidental encounter, a confrontation initiated by one party following the other, or a prearranged meeting that escalated beyond its intended scope. The presence of Kaitlin Crook at this location is a critical third variable in the equation. Her vehicle was identified at the scene. The sequence of arrivals and departures and with whom she arrived are facts essential to establishing narrative and intent. Investigative scenarios would be rigorously tested against the physical evidence. If Crook arrived with Moore and Rogers arrived separately, it could suggest Rogers sought them out. If Crook arrived separately before either man, it could suggest a planned meeting involving all three parties. If Rogers was present first, it could imply a different sequence of intentionality. Cellular telephone location data, extracted via search warrant, would be instrumental in plotting the movements of all three individuals in the hour preceding the shooting. This data, showing cell tower pings and potentially more precise GPS coordinates, could indicate travel patterns consistent with following, waiting, or converging from disparate points of origin. The digital footprints left by their devices would provide an objective, though not infallible, timeline against which to compare the subjective accounts of the survivors. The physical dynamics of the shooting itself would be reconstructed through forensic ballistics and bloodstain pattern analysis. The positions of ejected cartridge casings, which bear unique microscopic markings from the specific firearm that discharged them, create a map of where each shooter was standing when they fired. By correlating these positions with the final locations of the victims and the trajectories of bullets recovered from bodies and the environment, investigators can model the exchange of fire. This analysis can indicate whether the shooters were stationary or moving relative to each other, the approximate distance between them, and the directional paths of the bullets. Of paramount importance is determining the trajectory of the round or rounds that struck and killed Officer Crook. Establishing whether that fire came from the position associated with Rogers' firearm, Moore's firearm, or potentially both, is the single most crucial forensic determination in the case. This scientific finding would directly inform the legal assessment of criminal liability for her death, irrespective of any claims of self-defense between the two men. The moment of convergence was likely brief, lasting only seconds, but the analysis of its aftermath would require months of meticulous laboratory work. The stories told by the ballistic evidence, the cellular data, and the physical injuries would be juxtaposed against the statements given by Moore and, when medically possible, Rogers. Any significant dissonance between the forensic facts and an individual's account will become a focal point for further investigative inquiry and potential prosecutorial strategy. The hours and days preceding the 9 p.m. shooting on December 17th constitute the critical investigative timeline for establishing motive, premeditation, and the chain of decisions that led all three individuals to the Cedar Lane Drive parking lot. The State Bureau of Investigation's methodical reconstruction of this period will rely on a convergence of digital forensics, financial records, and testimonial evidence from peripheral witnesses. Primary sources of objective data will be secured through search warrants directed at cellular service providers for Kaitlin Crook, Zachary Rogers, and Joshua Moore. These warrants would seek historical cell site location information, which records the cellular towers a device connects to, providing a broad map of each individual's movements. More precise GPS data from smartphone applications or the devices themselves, if available, would offer a finer-grained geographical record. Concurrently, warrants would be executed for the contents of the devices, including call logs, text message archives, and data from social media and messaging applications. The digital correspondence between these individuals, particularly in the 24 to 72 hours before the incident, will be scrutinized for evidence of planning, threats, escalating arguments, or attempts at reconciliation. Financial and transactional records will provide another layer of factual context. Credit card statements and debit card purchase histories could indicate whether any of the individuals were at establishments near the scene earlier in the day, or if they purchased fuel, food, or other items that could corroborate their stated movements. Automatic license plate reader data captured by city or state cameras could potentially show vehicle movements on major thoroughfares leading to the Cedar Lane Drive area. Additionally, investigators would canvass for private surveillance footage from businesses and residential doorbell cameras in the vicinity, seeking video that might show the arrival of vehicles or interactions before the shooting began. This audiovisual evidence, while not guaranteed, could provide an incontrovertible record of the sequence of arrivals and the demeanor of the individuals as they exited their vehicles. The testimonial evidence from acquaintances, family members, co-workers, and neighbors will be gathered to construct a subjective portrait of each individual's behavior and emotional state in the preceding period. Interviewers would seek accounts of any expressed anxieties, specific threats made or feared, or notable changes in routine. For Zachary Rogers, fellow firefighters might be asked if he had discussed his estrangement or made concerning statements about his wife or her new boyfriend. For Joshua Moore, friends might provide context on the seriousness of his relationship with Crook and whether he had mentioned any prior conflicts or unsettling contact with Rogers. For Kaitlin Crook, colleagues might recall if she had appeared distracted, fearful, or had made any professional inquiries about protective orders or reporting harassment. A critical line of inquiry would involve checking local law enforcement databases for any prior police response to addresses associated with Crook, Rogers, or Moore for domestic disturbances or related calls for service, even if no official report was generated. The convergence of these evidentiary streams will allow investigators to test the plausibility of various scenarios. A scenario of premeditation will be supported by evidence of planning communication, such as a text message arranging a meeting, coupled with purposeful travel to the location. A scenario of a chance encounter would require evidence of routine, unrelated travel patterns for both parties that intersected coincidentally at that time and place, with no prior threatening communication. A stalking or following scenario would be indicated by cell location data, showing one individual's movements mirroring another's over a period of time prior to the confrontation. The actions immediately before the first shot, whether there was a verbal argument, a physical gesture, or the brandishing of a weapon, would likely only be known to the two survivors, whose accounts would be measured against the physical evidence of the scene itself. The period before 9 p.m. is therefore the narrative foundation upon which the legal understanding of the shooting's causation is built, determining whether the event was a spontaneous eruption of violence or the calculated culmination of a deteriorating domestic situation. The physical evidence central to the investigation comprised 2 handguns recovered from the Cedar Lane Drive crime scene by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation Evidence Response Team. As stated in the Lexington Police Department's initial release, one firearm was preliminarily attributed to Zachary Rogers and the other to Joshua Moore. This attribution was likely based on proximity to each individual's final position, witness statements regarding firearm possession, or preliminary registration checks. Each weapon was collected following stringent protocol, rendered safe by a firearms expert, if necessary, then secured in an individual evidence container to prevent cross-contamination of trace materials like gunshot residue, fibers, or DNA. The weapons were transported to the SBI's crime laboratory for a full comparative analysis, a process that would seek to establish definitive connections between each firearm, the ballistic evidence at the scene, and the fatal wounds. This forensic linkage would form the empirical backbone of the entire case, moving the investigation from narrative theory towards physical fact. The laboratory examination follows a meticulous sequence. First, each weapon is processed for latent fingerprints, though the textured grips of most handguns and the presence of biological material often yield incomplete or unusable prints. Swabs are taken from multiple surfaces, including the grip, trigger, and magazine, to collect possible DNA from the individual who handled it. It is important to note that DNA analysis in such contexts can be inconclusive. Samples may yield only partial genetic markers insufficient for a unique match, or may contain mixtures of DNA from multiple individuals, complicating interpretation. Following this, firearms examiners conduct function testing to ensure the weapon is operational, and then fire test rounds into a water tank or cotton recovery box. These test-fired bullets and cartridge casings are then microscopically compared to the evidence collected from the scene, the fatal bullet recovered from Kaitlin Crook's body during autopsy, any other bullet fragments, and all spent cartridge casings. The goal is to identify unique matching striations and impressions left by the barrel's rifling and the firearm's breech face and firing pin. A conclusive match can state that a specific evidence item was fired from that specific firearm to the exclusion of all others. The spatial distribution of the spent cartridge casings is itself a critical data set. Each casing's location, documented to the inch, helps reconstruct the positions and movements of the shooters. Casings eject in a predictable pattern relative to the firearm's orientation. By plotting these points, analysts can estimate where a shooter was standing or moving when they fired each round. The presence of casings from 2 distinct calibers intermingled or concentrated in separate areas can indicate the dynamics of the exchange. The autopsy results for Officer Crook, detailing the entry and exit wounds in the recovered projectile, will be integrated with this ballistic map. The trajectory of the fatal round, backplotted from her body's position, could indicate a line of fire that pointed toward a location where one of the 2 firearms was being discharged. This correlation would be paramount. However, findings can be limited. If the fatal bullet is severely deformed, a definitive match may not be possible, yielding only a class characteristic identification, AG, .40 caliber, consistent with one of the weapons. Similarly, if both firearms are the same make, model, and caliber, their class characteristics would be identical, and only the existence of unique microscopic marks from wear and tear could individuate them. The forensic conclusions regarding these 2 weapons would ultimately frame the legal questions. If the fatal bullet is conclusively matched to only one firearm, the focus of criminal liability for Crook's death sharpens on the individual who possessed it. If, however, the evidence suggests she was struck by round from both weapons, a forensically challenging but not impossible determination, the legal analysis becomes exponentially more complex regarding causation and mutual combat. Furthermore, the condition of the weapons, safety on or off, round in the chamber, magazine capacity, and any fingerprints or DNA evidence supporting who was the last to handle them will be factored into the overall sequence of events. The two guns were not merely instruments of violence, but silent witnesses whose mechanical and microscopic signatures held the potential to corroborate or dismantle the accounts of the surviving participants, transforming metallic objects into narrators of the final, violent seconds. The preliminary designation by the Lexington Police Department of an exchange of fire is a term of art with specific investigative and legal implications. It denotes a scenario in which two or more individuals discharge firearms at one another, as opposed to unilateral shooting. This initial assessment, based on the presence of two armed individuals with gunshot wounds and two firearms at the scene, establishes a fundamental dynamic of mutual armed engagement. The State Bureau of Investigation's forensic reconstruction would seek to validate in detail this exchange, determining its initiation, duration, and precise geometry. This analysis relies on the synthesis of multiple evidentiary streams: ballistic trajectory, bloodstain patterns, terminal bullet locations, the aforementioned cartridge casing distribution, and the wound paths in all three individuals as documented by medical personnel and the medical examiner. The reconstruction's objective is to create a scientifically supported model of the sequence of shots, a timeline of actions measured in seconds that culminated in a death. A critical component is trajectory analysis. When a bullet strikes a solid object, the angle of impact can be calculated based on the geometry of the defect. Investigators would examine any bullet strikes on vehicles, asphalt, or building facade in the vicinity. Combined with the known positions of the shooters derived from casing ejection patterns, these fixed points allow for the creation of lines of fire. The autopsy report for Officer Kaitlin Crook is paramount here, as it documents the path of the fatal projectile through her body. Forensic pathologists can often determine the angle of entry relative to the body's position. By establishing her location and posture, whether standing, turning, or falling, at the moment she was struck, analysts can extrapolate a line back to a likely point of origin. This origin point is then compared to the model positions of Zachary Rogers and Joshua Moore during the exchange. Corroborating this with the bullet defects in Rogers and Moore can indicate whether they were firing toward each other from opposing positions with Crook potentially in between, or from angles that suggest a different spatial arrangement. The number of shots fired is another factual anchor. The total count of discharged rounds is derived from the sum of spent cartridge casings recovered, plus any live rounds that may have been chambered but not fired. Acoustic analysis, if available from surveillance footage or shot spotter technology, could provide an independent count and sequence, though such evidence is not always present. The sequence of shots, however, is far more difficult to establish definitively without video. Investigators may attempt to infer sequence through bloodstain pattern analysis. For instance, a victim's wound that bleeds onto pavement, and then is stepped through by that same victim, can indicate that wound occurred prior to that movement. The timing of the exchange, whether it was a sustained volley or two quick, successive shots, also bears on the question of intent and opportunity to cease fire. A rapid, reciprocal burst may support claims of a sudden, mutual confrontation, while a more punctuated series could indicate a pause or a repositioning, factors relevant to self-defense assertions. The legal weight of the exchange of fire conclusion is substantial. It immediately introduces a potential for competing claims of self-defense under North Carolina law. Each participant could argue they fired only in reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm from the other. The investigation must therefore seek evidence of who was the first aggressor, a legal concept that can void a claim of self-defense if the person claiming it initially provoked the violence. Evidence of first aggression could be a verbal threat accompanied by a threatening gesture, the brandishing of a weapon, or the first shot fired. This determination often hinges on the subjective accounts of the survivors, measured against any impartial witnesses, and the physical evidence that might suggest who fired first, such as the location of first casing relative to a vehicle door, indicating a shot fired from near a car before an individual had fully exited. The exchange, therefore, is not merely a physical event, but a legal puzzle where the sequencing of milliseconds can determine culpability. The forensics of the exchange would either corroborate or contradict the narrative provided by Joshua Moore and, eventually, Zachary Rogers, making the silent testimony of bullets and casings the ultimate arbiter of the confrontation's true nature. The investigative process following a shooting with multiple armed participants inevitably centers on the accounts provided by the survivors. As the only living direct witnesses to the initiation and progression of the event, Joshua Moore and, upon his recovery, Zachary Rogers constitute irreplaceable but inherently subjective sources of information. The State Bureau of Investigation's protocol would involve conducting formal, recorded interviews with each individual as soon as their medical condition permitted, ensuring the interviews were separated in time and location to prevent collusion. The objective of these interviews is to obtain a detailed narrative encompassing the events leading to the parking lot meeting, the verbal and physical interactions immediately prior to the first gunshot, and the specific actions of each individual during the exchange of fire. It is an established investigative principle that in high-stakes incidents involving potential criminal liability, the accounts of involved parties will diverge, often significantly, on points critical to determining legal culpability, particularly the identity of the first aggressor. Joshua Moore, having been in stable condition, would likely have been interviewed within days of the incident. His account would be documented in its entirety. Zachary Rogers, given his critical condition, would present a substantial delay. His interview would be contingent upon his emergence from sedation, his cognitive capability, and the advice of his legal counsel. This temporal gap itself introduces variables, as Moore's narrative could become solidified and public through indirect channels before Rogers is ever interviewed, potentially influencing the investigative focus. During the interviews, agents would seek minute details, the exact wording of any verbal exchange, the direction for which each party arrived, who exited a vehicle first, the posture and hand positions of the other individual, and the perceived moment of threat became imminent. Agents would also inquire about the possession and purpose of firearms. Each survivor has a profound vested interest in framing the narrative to justify his own use of deadly force as a lawful act of self-defense, a justification that under North Carolina, law requires a reasonable belief of imminent death or serious bodily injury. The central task for the SBI is not to reconcile these accounts, but to test each version against preponderance of physical evidence. This forensic corroboration is the mechanism for assessing credibility. For instance, if Moore stated he fired only after seeing Rogers raise his weapon and fire a first shot, that account would be examined against a ballistic reconstruction. Does the distribution of cartridge casings support Moore's claimed position when he returned fire? Does the trajectory of rounds from Rogers' weapon align with a first shot directed at Moore? Conversely, if Rogers were to claim he drew his weapon only after being fired upon, his account will be measured against gunshot residue patterns on his clothing and hands, the location of his vehicle, and the nature of his wounds. Significant inconsistencies between an individual's testimony and the physical facts, such as claiming to have been stationary when casings show lateral movement, or describing a shooter's position that trajectory analysis contradicts, become pivotal points for follow-up interrogation and prosecutorial assessment. Furthermore, the severe trauma and physiological shock experienced by both men can affect memory, encoding, and recall, a factor investigators must consider. The perceptual distortions common during life-threatening events, time dilation, auditory exclusion, tunnel vision, can render even a truthful account factually inaccurate in its specifics. This does not imply deception, but highlights the necessity for physical evidence to anchor the narrative. The final, and perhaps most significant, complication is the death of Kaitlin Crook. Her perspective on the initial moments of the confrontation, which should have clarified intent and aggression, is lost. The investigators are left with two inherently conflicted narratives and a silent third party whose mortal wounds offer the only testimony she can provide. The divergence of survivor accounts is therefore not an investigative obstacle, but the expected condition of the inquiry, one that elevates the importance of ballistic, digital, and forensic pathology evidence to the role of objective arbiter in a case otherwise defined by subjective and oppositional recollection. The relational nexus between Kaitlin Crook, Zachary Rogers, and Joshua Moore inevitably oriented the State Bureau of Investigation's inquiry toward the dynamics of domestic conflict. This angle was formally acknowledged in external statements, notably by the North Carolina Fraternal Order Police, which referenced media reports characterizing the situation as domestic violence. From an investigative and legal standpoint, this classification shifts the analytical framework from a random or stranger-perpetrated homicide to one scrutinizing patterns of power, control, and escalation within intimate relationships. The domestic violence lens requires investigators to expand the temporal scope of their inquiry, well beyond the events of December 17th, seeking to establish a history of behavior that may provide context for motive and intent. This involves a meticulous search for prior law enforcement contacts, regardless of whether they resulted in criminal charges, and a forensic audit of digital communications for evidence of stalking, harassment, intimidation, or threats. The central investigative hypothesis becomes whether the shooting was a catastrophic endpoint of a prolonged campaign of coercive control or a singular, explosive confrontation arising from acute emotional provocation. The process mandates a comprehensive review of all police dispatch records and incident reports associated with the residential addresses of Crook and Rogers, both during their cohabitation and after their separation. Officers would be interviewed to recall any responses for disturbances, verbal arguments, or welfare checks. Even absent formal charges, these documented contacts can establish a pattern of discord. Furthermore, investigators would seek any applications for domestic violence protective orders filed by Kaitlin Crook against Zachary Rogers, or vice versa, within the Davidson County court system. The existence of an active order at the time of the shooting would constitute a significant factual and legal element. Concurrently, the digital forensic examination would target communications from Rogers to Crook and more following the estrangement. A pattern of unwanted, threatening, or obsessive messaging can demonstrate a motive rooted in jealousy and a desire to punish or reclaim, which is relevant to proving premeditation. The frequency and tone of communications in the days immediately preceding the homicide are of particular evidentiary value. The relationship between Crook and Moore is also examined within this framework, though from a different angle. Investigators would explore whether that new relationship had been a specific flashpoint for conflict, evidence that Rogers had made threats targeting more specifically, or had engaged in surveillance of the couple, would support a theory of targeted violence. Conversely, the investigation must also remain open to the possibility that the domestic conflict was not unilateral. While the physical evidence of the shooting would speak to the immediate actions, the background could reveal complexities, including mutual antagonism or previous confrontations between the two men. The domestic violence angle does not predetermine who the aggressor was during the final encounter, but provides the motivational backdrop against which claims of self-defense are evaluated. A history of threats or violence by one party can make another party's fear of imminent harm more reasonable in the eyes of the law. However, establishing that a volatile domestic history existed is distinct from proving a specific criminal intent to commit murder on December 17th. The latter requires linking the history directly to the planning and execution of the fatal meeting. The integration of this background context with the forensic findings from the scene creates the complete case profile. For instance, a documented history of Rogers making threats like, "If I cannot have her, no one will," combined with ballistic evidence showing he fired the fatal shot, powerfully supports a prosecution for first-degree murder. If, however, the investigation uncovers no such prior threats or conflicts, and the evidence suggests a spontaneous, mutual gunfight, the domestic label may speak only to the origin of the animosity, not to the legal classification of the homicide. The SBI's final report would need to delineate clearly between evidence of a general contentious domestic history and evidence of a specific, premeditated intent to kill. The emergence of the domestic violence angle thus broadens the investigation's depth and complexity, demanding a synthesis of historical interpersonal data with the physical facts of the shooting to answer the ultimate legal questions of who acted, why they acted, and with what level of criminal culpability. The assumption of investigative authority by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation represented a transition from initial response to a protracted, science-driven inquiry. The SBI's mandate was to compile an objective and legally defensible factual record, a process in which forensic science assumes primacy over narrative speculation. This procedural shift entailed the centralized control of all physical evidence, from the macroscopic vehicles, clothing, firearms, to the microscopic gunshot residue particles, trace DNA, and ballistic striations. The SBI evidence response team's work at the Cedar Lane Drive scene established the foundational inventory, but the conclusive findings will be generated within the controlled environments of the agency's crime laboratory. The analytical sequence is hierarchical, designed to build corroborative layers of evidence. Firearms and ballistic examination typically take precedence in a shooting investigation, as they address the instrumentality of death. This is followed by digital forensics on C's electronic devices, forensic pathology consultation on autopsy results, toxicology reports, and finally, the analysis of biological and trace evidence. Each scientific finding is expressed with explicit, quantified certainty or with the requisite caution when evidence thresholds for a definitive conclusion are not met. The laboratory analysis operates under stringent protocols to prevent contamination and ensure chain of custody, which is paramount for the evidence's admissibility in court. In the ballistic examination, as previously noted, examiners seek individual characteristics for conclusive matches. However, the reporting language is precise. A report may state that a bullet fragment was identified as having been fired from a specific firearm, indicating a conclusive match. Alternatively, it may state that a bullet is consistent with having been fired from a class of firearms, which includes a submitted weapon but does not uniquely identify it, or that the bullet is too damaged for a meaningful comparison. Similarly, DNA analysis on firearm grips or other items yields probabilistic results. A full DNA profile matching an individual provides strong associative evidence. More often, samples yield partial profiles or mixtures from multiple individuals. The report would then state that an individual cannot be excluded as a contributor to the mixture, often accompanied by a statistical weight, or that the sample is unsuitable for comparison due to degradation or insufficient material. Other forensic techniques contribute to the reconstruction. Gunshot residue analysis, involving the collection of kits from the hands and clothing of the surviving individuals, can indicate proximity to a discharged firearm. A positive result, however, is not definitive proof of firing a weapon, as residue can be transferred from the environment or through contact with a contaminated surface. Its value is generally corroborative, not standalone. Bloodstain pattern analysis on clothing and at the scene can help corroborate positions and movements. Digital forensics on cellular telephones provides a timeline of communications and location data, but this data is also interpreted with caution. Cellular site location information provides an approximate geographic area, not a precise pinpoint, and its reliability can be affected by network traffic and topography. The convergence of these independent forensic streams, ballistics, digital location, and crime scene geometry, creates a multifaceted model of the event that is resilient to challenge. The SBI's role culminates in the preparation of a comprehensive investigative file for the district attorney. This file does not render legal conclusions, but presents the aggregated facts. It will highlight areas of forensic certainty and, with equal transparency, areas of limitation or ambiguity. For instance, the report may conclusively establish which firearm fired the fatal shot, but may note that DNA evidence on the grip of that weapon yielded a partial mixture from which both the owner and another individual could not be excluded as contributors. It may present cellular data showing both parties were in motion toward the meeting point, but cannot definitively prove which party arrived first. The forensic command of the case thus provides a DA with a clear understanding of the strengths and boundaries of the physical evidence, delineating what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt from what remains interpretative or inconclusive. This rigorous, dispassionate methodology is designed to isolate the factual truth of the physical events from the emotionally charged narratives surrounding them, ensuring that any subsequent legal action is grounded in empirical reality rather than presumption. The death of Officer Kaitlin Crook and the critical wounding of firefighter Zachary Rogers precipitated an institutional and communal grief that permeated the city of Lexington's public safety infrastructure and extended into the civic body. The formal response from municipal leadership was characterized by public statements acknowledging profound tragedy while deliberately deferring investigative specifics to the State Bureau of Investigation. Lexington Police Chief Robbie D. Rummag's characterization of the loss as every chief's worst nightmare encapsulated the dual horror of losing an officer and the complex circumstances surrounding that loss. The department's internal mechanisms were activated, including the provision of counseling services through the Employee Assistance Program and the deployment of peer support teams to assist personnel, particularly those within Officer Crook's immediate squad and shift. This internal mourning was compounded by the necessity to continue providing uninterrupted public safety services to the community, a professional obligation that demanded compartmentalization of personal grief by the department's remaining officers. Concurrently, the Lexington Fire Department under Chief Michael R. Tofano faced a parallel crisis. One of its own was hospitalized in critical condition and was, by the preliminary statements of another agency, a central participant in a lethal shooting. This placed the fire department in a uniquely difficult position, requiring support for a wounded member and his family, while simultaneously navigating potential for that member to become the subject of a criminal homicide investigation. Chief Tofano's statement emphasized the tragedy's impact on the public safety family, a phrase acknowledging the intertwined professional and social bonds between police and fire personnel in a municipality of Lexington's size. The fire department also implemented counseling resources, creating a parallel support structure to the police departments. This bifurcated response highlighted the unprecedented nature of an incident that rendered two primary emergency response agencies as both grievers and entities touched by potential culpability. Public expressions of mourning followed established protocols for a line-of-duty death, yet were nuanced by the off-duty and domestically linked circumstances. The North Carolina Fraternal Order of Police issued formal condolences, and a processional ceremony from a medical examiner's office to a funeral home was likely conducted by law enforcement colleagues. The traditional public symbols of mourning, the black band across an officer's badge, the draping of bunting over the police department entrance, were displayed. However, the customary narrative of an officer killed by a criminal adversary in the act of protecting the community was absent, replaced by a more complicated and privately rooted tragedy. This complexity likely affected the communal mourning process, introducing a silence or hesitancy in public discourse that would not accompany a clear-cut line-of-duty death. The community's sympathy for the loss of a young officer was genuine, yet intertwined with the unresolved questions of the investigation and the simultaneous grave injury of another public servant. The mourning period was also an operational interregnum for the criminal investigation. The SBI's work continued independently, but within the city, a palpable tension existed between the need for respectful grief and the imperative for justice. Memorials and tributes to Officer Crook proceeded while detectives scrutinized the life she led and the relationships that defined her. Colleagues who attended her funeral would later potentially be interviewed about their knowledge of her personal circumstances. This juxtaposition, the public honor the uniform with the private dissection of the person who wore it, created an emotionally fraught environment for the agencies involved. The city's mourning was thus not a singular event but a layered experience, encompassing sorrow for a life lost, trauma for the departments involved, anxiety over the impending legal outcomes, and a communal patience strained by the wait for conclusive facts from the investigative authority that held the final word on how the tragedy would ultimately be defined in official records. The ultimate adjudication of factual responsibility and potential criminal liability in the shooting death of Officer Kaitlin Crook resides not with the local agencies emotionally and professionally connected to the victims, but with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation and the subsequent prosecutorial review by the Davidson County District Attorney's Office. The SBI's role is strictly investigatory and fact-finding. It does not make arrests, file charges, or issue public conclusions regarding guilt or innocence. Its mandate is to conduct a comprehensive, impartial inquiry and to compile all gathered evidence, forensic, testimonial, and digital, into a detailed case file. This file is then presented to the district attorney, who possesses the sole legal authority to determine whether the evidence meets the evidentiary threshold for criminal charges under North Carolina law. This procedural firewall is designed to ensure that the decision to prosecute, a profound exercise of state power, is based solely on legal sufficiency rather than public sentiment or institutional pressure. The SBI's final report will encapsulate the totality of the investigation. It will include the certified results of all laboratory analyses, the documented interviews with Joshua Moore and Zachary Rogers, when completed, transcripts of witness statements, forensic photography and diagrams, autopsy and medical records, and extracted data from electronic devices. The report will synthesize this information into a chronological narrative of the events leading to and including the shooting. Crucially, it will also annotate discrepancies, highlight areas where forensic evidence is inconclusive, and note any investigative limitations. For example, the report may state that ballistic analysis conclusively matched the fatal bullet to one specific firearm, but that DNA evidence on that firearm's grip was a partial mixture unsuitable for unique attribution. It may note that cellular location data confirms both parties were at the scene, but cannot establish with certainty which individual discharged their weapon first. This transparency regarding the boundaries of the evidence is a fundamental component of the report's integrity. Upon receipt of the SBI file, the District Attorney's Office will undertake its own review, applying the relevant statutes on homicide, potentially ranging from first-degree murder to manslaughter, and the law of self-defense. The legal analysis will be complex, particularly if the evidence supports a mutual exchange of gunfire. Key determinations will include whether the evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt which individual fired the shot that killed Crook, and whether that individual acted with malice, premeditation, and deliberation, or in the heat of passion. A critical assessment will be made of any claim of self-defense, evaluating its reasonableness based on perceived imminent threat as understood from the evidence. The DA must also consider practical prosecutorial factors, such as the viability of pursuing a case against a severely injured individual or the challenges of securing a conviction when the only eyewitnesses are the two adversarial participants. The decision may manifest in several forms: criminal charges against one or both men, a public declaration that the evidence supports a justified use of force, or a statement of the available evidence, while suggestive, does not meet the high burden of proof required for a criminal conviction. The period between the submission of the SBI report and the DA's announcement is typically one of formal silence, as the prosecutorial review is conducted. For the families involved, the police and fire departments, and the community, this interval represents a prolonged state of suspended resolution. The SBI's work provides the facts, but it is the DA's prerogative to apply the law to those facts. The final word on the criminal justice outcome is therefore a product of the sequential, deliberative process. It is a process designed to be methodical and dispassionate, insulating the decision from the acute emotions surrounding the case. However, it also means that closure for the community and the agencies is inherently contingent upon and delayed by this necessary legal procedure, leaving the profound human tragedy suspended within the framework of evidentiary standards and statutory interpretation until an official determination is rendered. The incident on Cedar Lane Drive represents a tragedy with enduring resonance, characterized by layers of loss that extend beyond the death of Officer Kaitlin Crook to encompass the severe injury of Zachary Rogers, the trauma inflicted upon Joshua Moore, and the profound institutional shock sustained by the Lexington police and fire departments. The available public facts outline a scenario in which domestic conflict between an estranged husband and a new boyfriend culminated in a lethal exchange of gunfire, resulting in the death of the woman connecting them. This narrative framework, while providing a plausible sociological explanation, does not constitute the specific, adjudicated truth required for legal resolution or cathartic closure. The precise factual truth of the moments immediately preceding the first gunshot, the verbal exchange, the initial aggressive act, the intent housed within each individual's mind, remains largely encapsulated within the conflicting accounts of the two surviving participants and the silent physical evidence. Without an independent eyewitness or definitive forensic revelation that unequivocally establishes a sequence of aggression, the core narrative of causation remains suspended between two opposing, self-serving interpretations. The State Bureau of Investigation's forensic findings can establish material facts with a high degree of scientific certainty: which firearm fired the fatal round, the approximate positions of the shooters, and the likely trajectories of bullets. This evidence can powerfully corroborate or refute specific claims made by Moore or Rogers. However, forensic science possesses inherent limitations in deciphering human intent. Ballistics can show that Rogers fired the shot that killed Crook, but it cannot scientifically prove whether he aimed at her intentionally, whether she moved into the line of fire, or whether his action was a negligent discharge during a confrontation with Moore. Similarly, digital evidence can map movements and communications, but cannot interpret the emotional state or specific intent behind those actions. The legal system requires proof of mental state, malice, premeditation, heat of passion, or reasonable fear to distinguish between degrees of homicide or justification. This evidentiary gap between physical action and internal intent is where definitive truth often becomes unattainable, leaving the case vulnerable to persistent doubt and conflicting interpretations. The potential for mutually exclusive claims of self-defense, permissible under North Carolina law, present a formidable barrier to a conclusive public resolution. If the physical evidence is consistent with both men firing in rapid succession, and if both assert they fired only upon perceiving an imminent threat from the other, the classic, he said, dilemma is rendered with fatal consequences. The death of Kaitlin Crook eliminates the one other witness who might have provided clarity on the initial moments of the confrontation. The district attorney's ultimate decision, whether to prosecute one party, both, or neither, will provide a legal resolution, but not necessarily a universally accepted factual one. A decision not to prosecute, based on insufficient evidence to prove criminal intent beyond a reasonable doubt, will be interpreted by some as a failure of justice, while others may view it as a correct adherence to burdens of proof. A prosecution that ends in conviction or an acquittal will still be contested by those aligned with the opposing narrative. Therefore, the case is likely to persist as a point of unresolved narrative within the community's memory. For the Lexington Police Department, the loss of Officer Crook will be eternally marked by the troubling and ambiguous circumstances of her death, complicating the traditional honor afforded to line-of-duty losses. For the fire department, the shadow of the event will linger over Zachary Rogers, regardless of his physical recovery or legal outcome. The quest for closure is inherently a quest for an unambiguous truth that explains and morally categorizes the event. In the absence of singular, incontrovertible account that aligns all forensic and testimonial evidence into a seamless whole, such closure remains elusive. The tragedy will instead be filed as a heartbreaking incident where the available facts outline a probable sequence of events, but fall short of providing the definitive, causational truth that the affected individuals, agencies, and community ultimately seek, ensuring the case remains a painful chapter defined more by its unresolved questions than by its answered ones. The investigation into the shooting death of off-duty Officer Kaitlin Crook on December 17th represents a complex intersection of personal conflict, professional duty, and forensic science. The established facts confirm a violent encounter in a Lexington parking lot between her estranged husband, Zachary Rogers, and her boyfriend, Joshua Moore, both of whom were armed and exchanged gunfire, resulting in wounds to all three individuals and Crook's death. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation's meticulous processing of the scene and analysis of ballistic, digital, and biological evidence provided the factual architecture of the incident's final moments. However, the core questions of intent, aggression, and legal justification hinged on interpretations of that evidence applied to the divergent accounts of the two surviving participants. The subsequent review by the Davidson County District Attorney's Office, based on the SBI's findings, would determine whether the evidence met the high threshold for criminal charges, such as murder or manslaughter against either party, or if the proof supported a conclusion of self-defense. This legal determination, while definitive in a procedural sense, may not satisfy the broader human need for a clear and morally resolved narrative. The case underscores the limitations of even a rigorous investigation in fully reconstructing the subjective realities and instantaneous decisions that precipitate lethal violence, particularly within a domestic context where histories are deeply private and motivations are emotionally charged. Officer Crook's death remains a profound loss, its impact amplified by the occurrence outside the protective structures of her profession and within the sphere of personal life. For the public safety community and the city, the tragedy is a stark reminder of the permeable boundaries between the personal and professional and the sometimes tragic confluence of private disputes and accessible firearms. The legal resolution provides an official endpoint, but the nuanced truth of the event and the closure it might bring is likely to remain a subject of quiet reflection and unresolved sorrow for those touched directly by its consequences. The file may be closed, but the complexity of the human dynamics it documents ensures the case endures as a somber study in tragedy, ambiguity, and the elusive nature of complete justice.